This is Matt Rosen, and this is The Grit Mindset with me, your host, Matt Rosen. The mission of The Grit Mindset is to inspire and empower our listeners by delving deep into the journeys of those who have faced significant challenges and emerged stronger. Through authentic conversations, we uncover the mindsets, strategies, and lessons that have propelled these individuals to overcome adversity and achieve success. My aim is to provide actionable insights and real-world advice to help our listeners cultivate their own grit and navigate their personal and professional lives with confidence and resilience. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of The Grit Mindset. I'm Matt Rosen, your host. I'm super stoked to have a buddy of mine and an American badass on the show today. His name is Daniel Elkins. He is the founder of the Special Operations Association of America. Daniel, welcome on The Grit Mindset.
What's up, dude? It's great to be back in Dallas.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So tell us a little bit about SOAA and what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Special Operations Association of America is the only nonprofit that advocates for all of the members of our community. So Navy SEALs, Green Berets, MARSOC Raiders, all of the different branches, as well as people that come out of the intelligence community. And we've been doing this for several years now.
That's awesome. Yeah, those are people that really are the reason we're able to have the freedoms we do. They're at the front line, tip of the spear, and it's awesome. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to start this organization to begin with.
Yeah, it's a really kind of long story that I think most people haven't ever heard. So my career has been kind of unique, being that I've been in the National Guard the whole time. So a lot of people don't even know that in the National Guard, they have special forces units.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I've known you all this time.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, through the course of my military career, as I became a Green Beret and went through the Special Forces qualification course, and then started to deploy, I was having to work a full-time job and then leave work and then come back to that work. And that presents really kind of unique issues for most people in a career progression, where if they have to leave, every year for at least 3 to 4 months, and then every 3 years for 6 to 7 months. But what I was doing in my professional career on Capitol Hill was I was working in the veteran advocacy space. And I had started at the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I went to the Enlisted Association of the National Guard. And as I kind of was maneuvering through the DC nonprofit space doing advocacy for veterans, I started to see this huge shift in warfare. And we moved away from deploying traditional units to deploying special operations units.
And when was that occurring? Was that around Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Iraq?
So, both components, the conventional and the special operations, deployed alongside one another. But around 2012, you started to see this shift. And then by 2016, towards the end of the global war on terror, you really saw that the preponderance of effort in Iraq and Afghanistan were being conducted by special operations forces at large. And what was really interesting is the veterans groups and the advocates in Washington, D.C. for veterans really were still advocating for all members of the military, where this really unique population was kind of left out. And that kind of started this process of me realizing that there was this huge gap, and members of our community at the tip of the spear were underrepresented, and their voices weren't being heard to policymakers and the administration.
Well, that's awesome that you saw an opportunity and develop this organization to help stand for those folks that really defend the freedoms that we all enjoy. So maybe let's back up a little bit. When was it in your early life you decided that you were looking to have a career both, in the government and armed forces?
So my father was drafted in Vietnam, and never really talked about it when I was growing up. But from an early age, as long as I could remember, I always played Army, and I wanted to be in the military. It's kind of funny because, I ended up becoming a Green Beret. But growing up, I really was fascinated by Navy SEALs and really looked into being a Navy SEAL. And then ultimately, I think one of the things that led me to go into the Army as opposed to the Navy was I don't really like being underwater.
No, isn't that a prerequisite to be a SEAL?
Yeah, and because God loves me, I ended up on a dive team in Special Forces for a while. So the joke was on me. But yeah, I always grew up. I love being outdoors. I was a Boy Scout, and I found just backpacking and being in the woods was something that I really enjoyed. And then that ultimately led me down a path where I wanted to serve, but in high school, I decided that I wanted to serve and started off doing nonprofit work and didn't go into the military until later in life. And it was in 2001, in the summer before September 11th, I found myself overseas in northern Nigeria doing nonprofit NGO type work. And no one at the time knew who Boko Haram was. And they came in to this area that we were working in northern Nigeria. And it was essentially committed a genocide or a mass murder.
And you were a witness to that?
So I wasn't a direct witness, but we experienced the effects of this fundamentalist group that had these ideologies, and they used violence in order to get the upper hand on the civilian population. And as someone that had never traveled overseas before, or someone that didn't understand how the world worked, it kind of put me into this spiral that I had to process through, and eventually that's what led me to join Special Operations.
Yeah, so you were in Nigeria when that happened. When did you decide you were going to be a beret?
So it was about 7 years later.
Okay.
I had left working overseas. I found myself working in Washington, D.C. I got really involved in training and trying to do MMA. Although I wasn't a good fighter at all. I had a few competitions, and this one guy beat my ass, and it was like the most humbling experience in the world. And that's when I realized I was like, yeah, there's a difference between professional fighters and amateurs like me that think that they're a fighter and they're not. And I ended up meeting some people who were Green Berets and had a chance to really talk with them. And the thing that really changed me fundamentally was the Green Beret mission, De Oppresso Liber. And it stands for to free the oppressed, or bringing freedom to the oppressed. And that really resonated with me. And I thought back to my experiences, at 18, 19, 20 years old overseas. And these people were living in this area and they were oppressed and they didn't know how to defend themselves. And that's kind of what the Green Beret mission is.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell us, if you can share, about some really challenging times or stories you had to go through, because I'm sure you've had many. You've told a few of them to me, but I'd love for you to share with our audience.
Yeah.
Maybe one or two of the most interesting situations you found yourself in since becoming a Green Beret.
Well, so I think the two come to mind instantaneously. One, the fall of Afghanistan and the work that our organization did to rescue and assist, like numerous people. And the other is my first real experience in combat, and you joke that I'm, a badass. I would actually say I'm probably the world's worst special operator, and we'll start with that because I think it's important for people to understand that, we receive a lot of training, but combat's chaotic and you make a lot of mistakes, and most people really don't want to know what being in war is like. It was my first time ever in a combat situation. And
where was this?
This was in Afghanistan.
Okay.
This is in 2017. And as the helicopters were landing, we were coming into what was considered a hot location, which means that it was subjected to potential enemy fire when we were landing. So there was a huge push to get off these helicopters as fast as you could to avoid, one of them being shot or disabled while it was landed, And I was first in the door to exit this helicopter, and I went to get up, and I was stuck in the door. And I have our team sergeant, and there's like 40 people in this helicopter that are waiting to get off. And I'm like trying to get up. I'm trying to get up. And I have this guy yelling, "Get the hell off the helicopter." And I'm like trying, and I like muscled through getting up because there's all this webbing and stuff like that. And we get on the ground, and I'm like, oh my gosh, and then we go to our different points of security and stuff like that. And it wasn't until several hours later that I realized that I didn't have my pistol anymore.
Would it have fallen out on the way out?
And it was a huge, huge deal. And I think, your podcast, you talk about grit and this idea of mentally dealing with failure, right? So I didn't know where it was at the time. It was my first time in combat, and I failed. I failed to do what's called PCC or PCI, right? So pre-combat inspection or pre-combat checks, right? So it's just this general idea of like when you move from point A to point B, you need to do a personal inventory of really sensitive equipment, important things, right? Now I had my rifle with me. It was actually strapped to my backpack. I had a SOAA with me, which is an automatic machine gun that was with me. And I was, a lot was going on. I was nervous, had a lot of adrenaline, and I failed to do an inventory and accountability. And if I would have done that at that time and called that up and been like, to my team leader, hey boss, this is what's happened. It's in the helicopter. That was what was keeping me, been like, no harm, no foul. I didn't realize it for a couple hours later. So then I didn't know where it was. And it was this huge ordeal. And, I had to make the decision and of like, what was I going to do? How was I, was I going to craft some story, some bullshit story? Was I, not going to say anything? And it was this moment of like thinking, man, my career's over. I just got out of the Q course. Everyone's going to judge me. And, ultimately I had to make the decision, and the decision I made was, I was like, hey man, bad news doesn't get better with time.
No.
And, as a mature adult, man to man, I had to go to my team sergeant and be like, hey, this is what happened. I don't know where it is. And then we figured out where it was. And then the guilt or the like, man, like, am I cut out for this job? I'd done all this training, it's my first time. What does everybody think of me? And you talk about the resiliency and what's necessary, right? How do you bounce back from that, right? So, I would say like, I wasn't the best Green Beret at the time, and I wouldn't say I'm the best Green Beret now in any capacity. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, but then, as years progressed and, I learned and I became a better Green Beret to then, a follow-on assignment several years later. I was specially asked to be a liaison at an embassy, right? And represent, my boss and his intent to the ambassador, right? So I think, we all have things that we do, and when we fail, and sometimes you fail really big, and it's easy for you to write this narrative, I am a failure. But I think that's very different than saying I failed at this, but I can improve, right? Yeah. I'm not the best yet, but I can get there.
So after that happened, how did the sergeant react, and what did you learn from that situation?
Yeah, I mean, he was not happy, right? There were serious implications and repercussions that I had to deal with for the rest of my deployment, right? But I was still in the fight, right? I was still on this multi-day mission. And the following day, one of my most pivotal life-changing experiences happened. And I know we'll get to the story of the Afghanistan fall, but I think that this goes to show how important mental resilience is, right? So the following day, one of our interpreters actually got shot, unfortunately, in the face. The great news is he survived, right? But people don't really think about how bad war can get. And I remember very distinctly because I assisted our medic with giving Johnny treatment. And when we got to him, because he had been shot in the face and his airways obstructed, we did not have time to onboard medicine to perform the procedure that we needed to do. And as a result, I had to straddle him and hold him down and look into his bloody face while they criked him and put this tube in his neck. And I had to watch him fight me, and we were friends. And, he didn't understand what was going on. And that's the type of thing that, you have to do. And just the day before, I had this thing that I was, and if I had let that get to me, I may have not been able to perform, right? So the thing that I learned is like, yeah, there's going to be setbacks, but you have to not internalize that as like, I am a failure, and it's like, and have the mindset of I can learn. And it's this mantra that I developed, which is always be improving every single day, be like a shark, just keep moving forward.
Well, I like that. It's not like I'm a failure. That was a failure. And
right.
I think that's an important distinction for people to make, because everyone's going to mess up in life, but knowing, yep, that was a screw up, but I'm going to keep moving forward, I think is great. So we'll get to the Afghan situation you talked about here in a second, but I want to ask, since you're on the grit mindset, what does grit mean to you, and where do you think you developed your grit?
So I think grit to me is hard work, perseverance, and strategy selection. I don't give an F if somebody is smart, because I know plenty of smart people who aren't resilient. You could be really brilliant, and in fact, I'm very fortunate. I got into Harvard and I was able to go to Harvard, and I met a lot of really brilliant people there that has much resiliency as like a sheet of paper, and it's because their whole life they're the smartest person. They're always the smartest person. And when they encounter something that's difficult and they don't get it on the first or second or third try, they just give up. Yeah. Right. Like there's no resiliency. Right. So I think like hard work, like having a strong work ethic, right? Having strategy selection. Okay, I tried this. I'm going to try this other thing. And I'm going to keep trying, right? And that keep trying, that's perseverance, right? So I think those three things, that's what grit is.
Yeah. No, I like that. So let's move on to story number 2.
Yeah.
When we departed Afghanistan, and that's when you and I met, was
right.
where you were advocating and trying to get help to get people out that had helped us during that conflict.
Yeah. So, we were in the right time at the right place, right? I feel very, very lucky. The people in the organization that I helped create, are some really big deal people. Former Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, a guy named General John Mulholland. He was the Task Force Dagger commander. That's the people who led us into Afghanistan. He was in charge of the Afghanistan invasion, right? And the first boots on the ground from the U.S. military. Morgan Luttrell, a member of Congress. We have some other members of Congress. So I got very, very lucky and that these people believed in this mission and saw this gap. And what was super interesting was, one of our first advocacy or legislative issues that we cared about was this thing called special immigration visas for Afghan and Iraqi interpreters, right? So more Americans would be in Arlington National Cemetery today if it wasn't for these interpreters that chose to serve shoulder to shoulder with us. And we made promises to them in turn for their service to the United States and the United States members of the military, that they would get a chance at immigrating to the United States in a legal pathway.
And Johnny was one of these guys?
And Johnny was one of these guys, yeah, and he got shot in the face. And the thing about Johnny is he went and he had surgery, and by the end of the deployment, Johnny wanted to go back out on mission with us because he was committed, right? So as the fall of Kabul happened, we left thousands and thousands of these interpreters behind who we had made promises to, right? And this was an issue, going into January of 2021, that was going to be our top 3 priorities for the year. So we had a lot of connection with interpreters on the ground. And as the situation in Afghanistan started to deteriorate, we were in this really unique position where we were able to deploy teams in the region, during the evacuation efforts. Myself and our teams didn't actually make it into Kabul airport, although that was the original plan. We had worked a deal out where we were originally intended to go into the airport, and we were going to help with medical coverage inside the airport. That ended up changing, and we ended up being able to go to Doha, to some of the lily pad sites where all these interpreters are coming, and then to Germany and assist there. But I distinctly remember, this is early of August, when things started to deteriorate, getting a call from someone on the phone, a really prominent member that worked, on Capitol Hill, and they were crying. Yeah. And they were crying because they were on the phone with the interpreters that they were trying to help, and they were having to make decisions on who lived and who died, and giving advice to, you can go, but your family's not on this list, and having to navigate that, right? And that's something that a civilian, they have no training in, right? And I remember looking at it through her eyes and being like, man, we have training to deal and navigate these things and make these really hard calls. And, it's really unfortunate, but, the federal government, mismanaged this. It was a pre-planned, coordinated exit, and it was a complete disaster. Right, a complete disaster that put American citizens that didn't have any military experience in this really hard place, right? That was super unfortunate. And, to have compassion, but also to realize that, we have in this community this unique set of skills that those skills don't go away when you take the uniform off. And there was a need. So we filled that need, and that was kind of the thing that put our organization on the map, and we were able to raise funds and get other people involved. And that's really what started the organization.
And how many of those interpreters were you able to get out after we exited?
Yeah, I mean, hundreds. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know that we sent, thousands of names of people through this coordination body at the State Department, right? People who are coming through our network. And I'm sure they overlapped with other people's networks as well, right? So, I think, we had several thousand that we submitted, but I'm sure that they overlap with other people. But then we also had dozens of U.S. blue passport holders. And this was something that's super interesting to me, is I remember watching the president of the United States saying there's less than 50 Americans in this country, or maybe it was like less than 100. It was less than some number. And we literally had passports of more than that amount of people who had been left behind, that hadn't been able to get to Kabul because, maybe they're there as missionaries, or they were doing some other sort of nonprofit work, or maybe they had family there that they were visiting, and they were trapped, right? And it's like, it's the federal government's job and responsibility to assist Americans who are in trouble overseas, and they weren't doing it, right? So we stood in that gap, and we tried to do our best to assist in that problem.
Well, thank you for your service and for what you've done. That's awesome that you guys were able to step in, help those that had made sacrifices, both American and Afghani, towards our efforts there. So talk with us about, SOAA, where it's at today, and maybe what have been some of the challenges of starting your own nonprofit. And
yeah. So I think this is a thing that most Americans haven't ever really thought of. It's this idea of what happens when the uniform comes off.
Yeah.
Okay. So we call it the Alumni Association, or the Edge Effect, right? And that'll make sense in a second. So let's say the U.S. military has trained, you, and spent, millions of dollars training you to become a really highly skilled person overseas, able to make decisions, and be responsible for millions of dollars of equipment, or secrets at the highest level of the federal government, right? And the day that you leave service and you take the uniform off, it's as if you do not exist to the federal government anymore. And, not all of people who retire out of the military, but a lot go on to have second careers, right? And in that gap, let's say you end up going to Harvard, like I did, or you go to Dartmouth, or you go to a top tier business school, and you open up a business, and now all of a sudden you're doing transportation or rare earth mining somewhere, in the Middle East or in Africa. And through your legitimate business, through your legitimate commercial enterprise, you start having access and placement to lots of different people that maybe the U.S. government would be interested in knowing about, right? There is no way for you to successfully, there's no easy pathway for that information to be brought back in for decision makers and policymakers to evaluate that, right? So that's what we have tried to do. We try and amplify. We call it the ground truth. It's like a military term, right? The guy or gal on the ground knows what's going on, not some armchair quarterback sat thousands of miles away. So how do we successfully elevate that to the right people to keep America safe, right? So what do? We keep America safe by elevating and amplifying the voice of the special operations community. But it's like pulling teeth, right? Because, when we go to the State Department and we're like, okay, we have this subject matter expertise, we have to always start over. Okay, now we're going to DOD. We have this person that's doing some sort of mergers and acquisitions, and they've come across a bunch of illicit fentanyl, like forensic accounting. How do we get that information to the correct people? Right. There's no easy pathway. And that's been one of the struggles. One of the things that we're trying to do is trying to streamline that process, because service doesn't end when you take the uniform off.
Right.
Even though the federal government, forgets that you exist, all that training, all that patriotism, what to look for that your average civilian may not even recognize is valuable information. Right. We have ability to capitalize on that. So there's so much sitting on the ground that we're not accessing, and we're trying to change that.
So what can everyday listeners or people tuning into the podcast, is there anything they can do to help or play a role in either helping leverage these special operators or get their voices out? What can the average person do about that?
Yeah, I think there's two things that you can do. One is, very practical for our organization, and one is just general for your listeners. Like, we're a nonprofit. If you want to donate money, you can go to our website.
We'll make sure we post that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can donate money. If you want to get involved and volunteer your time, maybe you are good in, accounting, or you're good in logistics, or you're good in like grant writing. There's ways that you can help. If you want to volunteer for some of our overseas things, or even our domestic stuff, we treat people, we help get people treatment for PTSD, people who are wounded, so on and so forth. So I will unapologetically ask your listeners to donate money to the organization. It's a good cause. Be a partner with us. But separately, I think it's this idea of getting to know people who have worn the uniform.
Yeah.
And if you are fortunate enough to know someone that is from the special operations community, I think you could learn a lot by getting their perspective of what they saw overseas and some of the issues that they saw and the bureaucratic red tape that they had to deal with. And please, don't ask them if you've ever killed somebody. We don't want to hear that, right? But get to know them. And there's a lot that I think may surprise your listeners about some of the bureaucratic nightmares and red tape that exist, like where we know where the guy is, the bad guy, and we have all the confirmation. And then there's this approval process where we're not allowed to go get that person. And that's a whole nother political conversation. But I think hearing that from first person, I think really will change people's understanding of how the national security process works.
Yeah, that's got to be frustrating. Didn't we know where bin Laden was for years before we went to go get him?
Yes, 100%, right? Yeah, absolutely. And that happens way more often than I think people think, right? And it's this idea of coordination efforts. And this is why we've become what I would say is a trusted partner with DOD. We're not waging war. We're not a paramilitary organization. We have an alumni association that has access and placement, is doing legitimate commercial business around the world. But that information is very valuable. And sometimes there's hurdles that DOD has because of the legality that we don't, right?
Yeah.
When Americans were trapped in Gaza, we had people who were doing business there, and we were able to help evacuate those Americans.
That's awesome.
Because of that.
Any other either conflicts or things you guys are actively engaged in right now that you can talk about?
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of work in Ukraine over the years, and then most recently we were involved in helping facilitate safe passage for Americans in Gaza. Luckily, since the new administration's come in, there has not been any kind of crises that are of biblical proportion, since then. So, that specific skill set has been unnecessary. But yeah, right now we're actually really engaged domestically in helping advocate for new treatments for PTSD and something that's called operator syndrome, which is basically very similar to what the NFL researched with people that get concussions or subconcussive events. Special operators are having that same type of impact on their body, and we're seeing some neurodegeneration in the same way, and we're really trying to move the needle in that area.
Got any effective treatments on the way for those? Or
the research is really, really interesting. It highlights that people that have a lot of low impact or subconcussive events, parachuting, being around munitions, people jumping on and off trucks, that you start to see some hormone dysregulation. And believe it or not, most people that have been in kind of physically demanding fields of work at about 10 years, you'll start to see really interesting or odd hormone dysregulation, depression of things like testosterone, increases of things like estrogen and cortisol. And we attribute that to a lot of the symptoms that may be diagnosed as PTSD or just being overly stressed or agitated.
Yeah.
And when you start to treat with hormones, you see a lot of that go away.
That's fantastic. Well, we were real short on time here, but as we wrap up this episode, any final thoughts to share with our listeners or anything we didn't cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this idea of always be improving is just something that is so ingrained in me, and that this notion that I'm a failure versus I failed, and I'm not there yet. I mean, I think the whole notion of grit and really being able to get through hard situations, I think when you start in that headspace of like, I'm a horrible person or I'm a failure, or I can't do this, that's when you end up quitting. Versus this is hard, but I can do this, or I'm not there yet, but I will be there. So, man, I really appreciate you having me on the show, Matt, and I look forward to coming back again soon.
No, it's awesome. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for your service. Thanks for all you do for our country and for our special operators. For those of our listeners out there, you can find SOAA.org. If you're willing to, please provide a donation or, hit up Daniel. He and his crew are great. Hopefully you were able to take something away from the show today. Lots of great lessons learned from an American hero. Until next week's episode, this is Matt Rosen signing off of the Grit Mindset. Stay gritty out there.